Wait, Jack, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Have you guys gotten vaccinated yet?
Yes, I have. I was vaccinated in April and May. At that time, it was actually a lot more busy than it was now. So we had to wait a couple weeks before there were actually open slots. But I believe the availability in California at least is thinned out. But I heard you may have got vaccinated recently. Is that correct?
Well, recently is one way to put it. I got vaccinated today. First dose.
And that was that Pfizer?
Yes, indeed, it was Pfizer.
And how was the experience? Like, were there a lot of lines? Was it busy? And was it painful?
Yeah, I died today.
Interesting.
Interesting.
So are you sending that message that you don't want others to get vaccinated? Or what do you or do you think it's worth it?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm sure for those with years, I have not died. But I mean, I guess I had, the usual, right? People say it's your arm's sore for a while. Um, and then they say the majority of the side effects come on at the second dose, right? Which I'll have to wait 3 weeks to get. But I mean, honestly, well, actually, you know what that does mean? I am now eligible, you know, to I am now eligible to be chosen to win $1 million in the Ohio lottery, vaccine lottery.
Oh yeah, I
So
forgot
yeah,
about that. Like, how is that working out? Has it actually increased vaccination rates?
you know, to be honest, I think everybody like here has forgotten about it, just because it's so inconsequential for most people. But I think what's actually interesting. I think I saw a report in the news the other day. It was like from Boston University or something, and they were saying like, oh, these vaccine lotteries in Ohio or California or wherever, they actually don't increase. They don't help out at all in terms of vaccination rates. Um, Certainly, evidently, right? I've only gotten vaccinated today, so I guess I, am kind of proof of that. But I mean, for me, it's mostly just been because that I couldn't find a good time to actually stop and get the vaccine.
And I would expect that most people either really want the vaccine or they really don't. So I don't think a financial incentive is really going to change much. But are you the first in your family to get vaccinated, or have others in your family been vaccinated?
Well, no, actually, my dad is fully vaccinated, and my mother is also first shot. She got her first shot like 2 weeks ago, so I'm technically the last um, to get the vaccine because I've been going all over the place. I went to DC like what 5 days ago, a week ago, so
And
it's been
and
kind
and
of.
and so you've been to so many places, and have you got COVID yet, or been in contact with anyone with COVID?
I mean, I have not gotten COVID. I would hope that I have not been in contact with anyone with COVID. Um, but yeah, I guess that's all I can say, huh? Um, by the way, actually, speaking of traveling places, you have didn't you go on another transit like day transit run like a few days ago? Or am I
I
remembering
did. I
thinking
don't
of
actually
things?
remember if I had mentioned it in past recordings, but I did take a trip briefly to Vallejo to ride the San Francisco Bay Ferry. That was my most recent
Oh,
trip.
that's right. That's right.
Um,
Okay, I think we mentioned that. Okay.
yeah, but I
Yeah.
guess even I'll repeat it. But I think that was a really good experience for me because I had not taken the ferry at all. And yeah, we did definitely talk about this, but I do just want to emphasize that ferries are a good mode of transportation, especially in the Bay Area. For those who are listening who may be from the Bay Area, I recommend the ferry because it can. It's actually quite a long drive from Vallejo to the West Bay, so if you want to cut down on time and emissions, take the ferry.
I will also add to that. This episode is not about San Francisco ferries, but also add to that. If you are ever in the mood to go to Angel Island, which is a state park in the San Francisco Bay, I have taken the ferry there, and it is a decently pleasant ride, I will say. If you're a tourist, of course.
Yeah, I think I was pleasantly surprised by the ferry, and I think from your experience, ferries are certainly better than they might look at on the surface.
I mean, yeah, especially compared to like a lot of other cities, even in the U.S., who either don't have ferries at all, or the ferry service is just completely horrible.
But speaking of places where ferries could work out, um, I was thinking about Chicago as a city to do a transit review on, and I think that'd make a good discussion to talk about because of course they're on Lake Michigan, but they also
Yeah.
have a lot of other transit options. So I think we had envisioned discussing what the Chicago transit system was looking like right now, and whether it's a good system to ride and if it covers needs. So and of course to how you live in Cincinnati. Have you been to Chicago many times?
Believe me when I say I've been to Chicago more times than humanly possible. Well, first of all, right, because we go to Chicago because it's only 5 hours away. That's like the limit for like a day trip, right? So sometimes in the weekends we're like, oh, hey, let's go to Chicago. Other times, for example, we're taking international flights. So because we want to save money, flying out of Cincinnati is horribly expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So we always drive 5 hours to Chicago, right? And then
Five
save,
hours. Wow.
yeah, but that saves in flights, especially internationally. That saves like, you know, sometimes like up to, $800, which is absolutely worth, a 5 hour drive and however whatever much else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then for example, school trips, right? Orchestra trips or whatever else. Whenever we go anywhere, it's either Chicago or DC. Or Chicago or DC. Or Chicago, right? There's no other variation because there's just no other, major interesting city within that large range. So I've been to Chicago a ton of times. But what about you?
So I've been there twice now, and I will be going back at the towards the end of this year. Uh, and both were for mostly just vacation purposes. I haven't actually gone there for flights and to take cheaper flights out of the airport. Actually, the first time I went there, were mostly there to as a vacation, but also a launching ground for taking the Empire Builder to the West Coast. So I guess that was an interesting reason to go there. But otherwise,
Hmm.
no, not really as interesting as saving on flights or school trips. But I'm curious. So, how do you think Chicago compares to Cincinnati, at least in terms of its mobility and transit options?
I mean, I think that question is like it's legitimately comparing apples to oranges. Because just think about Chicago, right? Let's go through all the major ways, right? Let's go through, road, rail, air, and sea, right? Road. Chicago is, the hub and a huge hub of so many different interstates coming from, the northeast, coming from the northeast from Michigan, coming from the southeast from Ohio, Indiana, coming from the plain south, like throughout Illinois and Missouri, from the west, the gateway to the west, right? Interstate 80, Interstate 90. So Chicago's set there. Cincinnati has, you know, two, three, four interstate highways. In terms of rail, right? There's no discussion. Chicago has its own subway. Chicago has its own commuter rail. Chicago is hub of Amtrak. Cincinnati gets Amtrak service thrice weekly in one direction at 1 or 3 a.m. Flights. Chicago O'Hare, Chicago Midway, hubs of United, American, and Southwest. Cincinnati has a, CVG airport. It used to be busy in the 90s, but Delta has abandoned us, right?
Yeah,
And
that was
water
during their
travel.
bankruptcy, right?
Exactly. Well, I mean, especially during their merger with, Northwest,
Mm-hmm,
right? There
mm-hmm.
was no need, but that's a story for another time, right? Then Delta had Detroit, and so no longer needed Cincinnati. But again, story for another time. And in terms of water transit, right? Chicago is situated on Lake Michigan, right? There are certainly boating opportunities. I don't believe there are. regularly scheduled ferries anywhere, but I have been on one of those nightly boat rides, one of those, what do you call it, night dinner cruises to
Yeah,
Chicago.
the ones from Navy Pier, is that what it is?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly. I've been on one of those. Cincinnati, we have a river that looks like chocolate milk.
But actually, you do bring up an interesting point about the roads, at least because I'm under the impression that a lot of those, at least that go into Indiana, are toll roads, which you don't really have a lot of. But is it expensive to drive around at all? Do you know?
Well, I mean, yeah, especially like if you're driving out in the suburbs. I believe it's 294, which is a toll road. But I mean, thanks to the apps, thanks to phones, there is such thing as, the avoid toll option, which is what we always do. So it's really, there's no required tolls anywhere, right? Since there's no, choking point that people need to get in and out of. For example, like, the Bay Area.
Yeah, certainly the congestion. I think in general, all across Chicago, it's a much interesting, much more different city in terms of the way it's laid out because, of course, everything flows into the city center, but there's also a lot of ways out rather than in the Bay Area. There's really only like one or two entrances, three or
Well,
four, and
part of that is just attributed to the fact that Chicago doesn't have its own bay. It's just situated. It's just land and water
yeah,
right
yeah.
next to each other. So there's definitely that. But I think what we should, I think would be a good starting point for Chicago's public transit. Of course, we'll be going over the system itself, and then afterwards we'll be assigning a letter grade for Chicago, right? But in terms of public transit, um, so Jack, what systems are there? There's the L,
Yeah,
the
so
subway
my
system.
understanding there's the RTA actually from what I was researching is the which manages all of their agencies and there's they consider them to be three like you said the CTAL, there's the Metra commuter rail and then there's the Pace suburban bus which I believe are the three big ones to my knowledge.
Oh, by the way, fun fact. Do you know why? Well, the subway system, right? The L. Do you know why the subway is called the L?
Well, I thought it was just because it means elevated, but is it
Yeah, yeah,
different?
exactly, exactly. It means elevated, which is funny, I suppose. But of course, with lots of systems, not all of it is elevated, right? Um, quite quite a lot of decent sections, especially the blue line, which goes to and from O'Hare Airport, is actually underground. So not so elevated there.
And I was surprised to see that actually a lot of the Blue Line towards I think Forest Park or whatever the other terminus is actually like a grade level, and I was curious to see they had actual grade crossings with third rails, which seemed a bit dangerous to me, but
Mm,
I guess it works
yeah.
out.
So basically, just as a quick overview, the Chicago L, the subway system, it's basically, I guess it's sort of similar to, for example, BART, which in the Bay Area, which you covered before, in that it has a bunch of lines going to and from spokes, right, to and from the suburbs, and they all convene in this big loop, in the center of town, and the trains basically go around that loop and then go back up their spokes, right? So that's the L. And then the commuter rail is Metra, eh? Which
Mhm.
follows mostly the same thing. It's a bunch of commuter rail lines going further out into the suburbs, and then the pace suburban buses, which are buses in the suburbs, eh? So yeah, it's a pretty standard setup, I would say. Um,
Yeah, and I guess
but
compared to BART, the only difference is that BART, of course, has that the one orange line, which doesn't actually go into the city center, but every single line in the L system does go to the city center.
yeah. So actually, let's talk about that first, right? Um, well, first of all, I think what we should do first is, Jack. I mean, you said you've taken the L before, eh?
I have.
Yeah. So let's start off with the subway. What were your impressions of taking? Well, first of all, where did you just take it like to and from one place or?
So
Was it
I've been on every line. Most of
okay?
them have been from the loop into either places, mostly all in the northern or western southern parts. So I haven't actually rid it that much just around the downtown area. Usually I would get on the loop and go outside unless I was coming from O'Hare, which I did once. Um, I would say that the bulk of my experience has been riding it from the loop to the northern sections of town by the Wrigley Field area, of course, because you have a lot of service there. You have the red line, the brown line, and the purple line. So there's certainly a lot of ridership in that section. But I have been on it in a lot of sections. So I would say I have a multitude of experience.
Mm. So what do you think of the L? Right. This is the standard question. What do you think of the accessibility, the comfort, all the rest?
Well, the accessibility is actually an interesting point because, like you said, it's elevated. So a lot of the stations you have to walk up tons of stairs to get to, which can be
Mm-hmm.
kind of a hassle, especially if the elevator is broken. But I think
Mm-hmm.
the accessibility is certainly something that can be improved. Uh, with nearly all of the stations in the city center, except for some of the red and blue line stations, are elevated, of course. And comfort is really like average, I would say, because the seats are really just a standard subway seat. I think it's interesting. Bart has actual like airline style seats that are much more comfortable than a regular subway style seat, and of course the L is definitely much more of a subway system rather than a commuter rail or heavy rail system. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it certainly functions that way, even though it's elevated. It doesn't have to be below ground to be a subway. Uh, so in that regard, it's very much like a typical subway to me, and it doesn't really have anything lacking for it. But what do you think of that in terms of its comfort? Because that is an interesting point.
We'll see. Comfort, I think like you said, it is very average, right? But I will say that one of the big things about the comfort itself is that the seats, for example, right? They are again, as you said, they are subway style. So, in terms of just on the subway, I think it certainly does perfectly fine, right? I would say that actually on the point of accessibility, it's again, right? There's improvement that could be done, especially if the elevator is not working, right? For people who either can't or you know don't want to walk up tons of flights of stairs. But what I do want to talk about actually is a problem that I personally have with the Chicago transit system, and is a main one which a lot of people complain about quite often, and that is and this this is about Chicago in general, not just the L, right? So it exists with Metra as well. But if you look at the map, right, and we've talked about this, you will see that it is entirely a hub and spoke system, right?
Yeah,
You have the lines going, you have the red and purple line going to the north, the brown line to the northwest, blue line to a slighter western northwest, green line going straight west, um, pink and orange going to the southeast, southwest, and then the green and red going down south, right? um it is very much it is very much a hub and spoke system, sorry. But what is entirely lacking is connecting the suburbs, right? If you want to go, for example, from O'Hare Airport, right, to, let's say, Midway Airport, there's no direct route to go um, to and from the airports, right? They're basically both in the suburbs, but it's just O'Hare Airport is more north than Midway. If you want to take transit, you have to take first the blue line all the way into downtown Chicago, which takes like 40 minutes, and then take transfer onto the orange line, and then take the orange line all the way out to Midway, right? So, and that takes, ages
yeah,
effectively. Um Conversely though, if you take a drive, if you just drive, right, go in a direct route from O'Hare to Midway, it takes you like what, 30 minutes versus what, 2 hours, one and
yeah,
a half
yeah.
hours. And so I guess it's just one of my personal issues with Chicago, right? It's in lots of cities, for example, you know, maybe less so in America, but in a lot of cities in Europe or Asia, you'll notice that there's always a presence of like a loop line, right, which just goes slightly around the city center, right, connecting, you know, the suburbs. This exists in, you know, often exists in Japan or China, as well as, you know, for example, London, Paris. They all have a loop line. And what often happens is that, for example, you know, the loop line, it turns out to be, you know, the biggest line, the most busiest line, just because it is the one that is literally going around and around and around in a loop. It connects all the, you know, all the people who, you know, who don't live along a spoke, right? And there's just none of that in Chicago. There's only that in there's only that in, you know, the loop, which is city center. There's nothing connecting the suburbs, which I just think to be a great waste of opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago would certainly tell you they have a loop line, but of course, when you look at it, it's only like 6 stations in the city center.
Yeah,
Uh, and
yeah. Chicago is like, we have a loop already, right? It's literally called the loop.
and you know it's interesting because actually when I'm going to Chicago in October, we're landing in O'Hare, but we have to our hotel is right next to Midway Airport, and
Oh,
we land at O'Hare at around 11:30 at night, and we were looking for transit options to get to the hotel, but of course, like you mentioned, you have to go to the city center first. So when it comes to competition, the Uber is only like 30 minutes, but the transit's close to 80. So uh, from a time standpoint and getting and trying to get to the hotel at a reasonable time, of course, transit's never going to be competitive in that section. Of course, if you do look at this map, towards the western parts, I at least noticed there is a presence of some of the pace buses that do go between some of the Metra stops at, I believe, hourly frequencies.
mm-hmm,
So there
mm-hmm.
certainly is some of the bus systems, but I think if we want to get to the level of the loop line service that you mentioned in Asia, I think we're going to need some bigger and better bus systems that either run more
Massive,
frequently
yeah.
or have like a BRT element to it that can make the trip faster because these bus lines still take like 30 or 40 minutes to get between these stations, which is still not it's still not great.
Actually, speaking of which, let's talk about pace buses next. Have you ever been on a pace bus actually?
I have not, but I would really like to.
Yeah, they're nothing special either.
Have you been on it?
um, of course, of course. I remember this one time. So we were taking a family trip to Cancun in Mexico, and you know, we drove up to Chicago because flights from Cincinnati are expensive. And we stayed in a hotel, right? We were traveling with my grandmother, right? So we stayed in a hotel right by O'Hare Airport for ease of access. Um, but because, you know, as a transit freak, right, I obviously wanted to go and you know, take transit into the city, right?
Hmm.
And so, you know, but coming back, like that day we came back, there were no more shuttles, hotel shuttles running to and from the airport. So I had to take a pace bus. It was like what, 15 minutes on the bus from O'Hare Airport. So not far at all. But here, I'll just give little recount of what it was like. Basically, at least from O'Hare Airport, the buses left at literally, you know, O'Hare Airport has its own, what do you call it? The terminal, what do you call it? Terminal transit, the terminal train,
Yeah, the air train.
air train. Yeah, O'Hare has one of those, right? And the pace bus, it leaves from like the furthest station, literally called remote parking. So what we had to do is we had to take the blue line all the way to O'Hare from the city center, take the air train all the way to you know, the remote parking station, and then get on the pace bus, right? Wait for the pace bus, make sure it was the right one, and all of that. Um, at that time, you know, it was busy Christmas night. It was the Christmas season, right? So that meant there were a lot of travelers there. But the pace bus, you know, it left only once an hour from O'Hare, which was pretty bad, especially given that it's O'Hare and Chicago. And so basically, you know, another thing is that a lot of the pace bus signs, they are very very easy to miss. So what we had to do is that I had to hold my phone right with the route the entire time. Even had to ask the driver to help remind us, just because I saw that, you know, a lot of the signs were just completely worn down, or the stop signs, right? The signs for a bus stop, they're just completely worn, and basically inserviceable, right? Unserviceable. So I took the Pace bus that what 15 minutes
Hmm.
from O'Hare to the hotel. Got back safely though, and then it was snowing and super cold outside, but I guess it worked.
What was the
Got
ridership
back.
like? Were you the only ones on it?
Actually, yeah, it was surprisingly busy. There were like what 15 people on the bus, so
Oh,
it
that's
wasn't like
pretty good.
packed. Yeah, but the problem was it was Chicago by O'Hare Airport, Christmas travel season, right? Night run of a pace bus from the airport to the nearby hotels only left once an hour, right? So I mean, not exactly the best, but hey, um, in terms of I guess that's my story, right? But in terms of the pace, the connecting map, like the accessibility, the extent of service, I guess it's you know it, it, I guess it's just in my point of view, it's a bus, certainly a bus service, right? Nothing too special.
Yeah, it was. I think it's satisfactory to some extent because I was looking at ways that I could go between some Metra stops if I wanted to just go out there and rail fan, and it's possible. You can take some pace buses that the transfer times work out well, and it doesn't take that long. It only takes like 40 or 50 minutes, and you can go between Metro stations that otherwise would have taken you 2 hours if you take the Metro into the city and back out again, which of course is incredibly inconvenient. Uh, and I just hope that these pace buses continue to be used because I can't imagine what transit would be like if they're lost.
Mm-hmm.
I also hope that there's some effort to improve them in the future, but I would imagine that the willingness of people in those suburbs to take transit is pretty low, just because it's a fairly conservative region, at least the suburbs of Chicago.
Conservative, huh?
Of
I
course,
mean, okay.
Cook County is certainly Democratic, but the suburbs of Chicago are still pretty.
Uh,
Many of them
yeah,
have voted Republican and
yeah. Politics
anti-transit.
is politics. Yeah, politics is politics. But I mean, I will say another thing to point out is that like there are basically no pace buses which go which approach on the territory of the CTA, right? So if you look at a map, pace just stops as soon as as soon pace service stops as soon as they hit one or two of the 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 L stations, right? So there's an exact divide between pace buses and CTA buses. Um, so in that sense, I guess it's kind of, in a sense, it could be seen as inconvenient because from a location in the suburbs where you're not within easy access to a subway station, it can take quite a while because then you have to transfer from potentially even multiple pace buses just to get to a stop, right? Or even to transfer onto a CTA bus. But I guess it certainly does again serve its purpose, which is to act sort of as funneling suburban riders onto the L into Chicago. It's just I think in terms of connectivity with the buses, right? You will see if you look at a map, you will see that a lot of the CTA buses and the pace buses, there's a pretty clear divide in terms of that, which I don't know. I guess there could be more intertwining, right, of the systems.
Yeah, I would expect the biggest goal for Pace should be making sure the connections are maximized to the CTA and to Metra, especially Metra, because that's most of where the service goes, at least. And Metro would probably be quicker to get into the city than a CTA L train if you take an express train. But speaking of Metra,
Speaking of Metra, the
have you had a chance to ride it at all? And if
I
so,
have
what were your impressions?
I have only ever taken one ride ever, which was well because I really wanted to ride Metro, right? Our hotel was the time I took Metro was our hotel. Actually, no, it was coming back from the trip to Cancun. Actually, our hotel was along the Blue Line, So what I did is the night before I took Metra, I was in downtown Chicago again, and I went to the transit center to buy a physical ticket, and it was from Jefferson Park. Basically, Jefferson Park is a metro station which also shares a station on the Blue Line. So the next morning, like at like 6 a.m., I woke up and then I took the Blue Line two stops. Two stops? Three stops? Two stops. I don't know.
I'm not as good
Two.
with Chicago geography as you are, so you
I
probably
think
know.
it was I think it was two stops down the Blue Line onto Jefferson Park Station, and then from there I caught the metro going into downtown Chicago. It wasn't a long ride, of course, but it
Mhm.
was a ride for sure. What about you? Have you taken metro ever?
So I've been on Metro twice. I've been only
Wow, more
once
than
on the on
me.
the on the on the diesel train. So I took the UP North line, I believe it was wherever the green coloring is. One stop from Ravenswood to Clyburn, and that was really short. It
Where's
was only
that?
so Ravenswood is a northern suburb. It borders the Damon Metro stop on the Brown line. So I guess for a clear reference for viewers, that would be near the it's near Wrigley Field. So in like the I believe
Oh, it's
it's in the
not.
north
Wait,
part
it's
of
not.
Chicago.
It's literally one stop. Like it's really close to the center too.
Yeah, and I only took it one stop south to Clyburn, which was I believe 7 minutes. So I didn't actually spend that much time on that trip on it, and it's very similar to Caltrain actually, because of course they use the same rolling stock. Although Metro does have the green windows, and
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the upper level isn't the one you have on Caltrain. You have I believe it's actual like bench kind of seating like what you'd have on a CTA train. So it's different seating, but of course the cars are the same and if not older. But also I did take Metra a second time. I took the electric district train, so the actual electrified Metra from Millennium to I believe 55th Street, wherever the U Chicago station is. So that was a much longer trip on a much faster and quieter train. So that was a bit of a different experience. Of course, the windows are still green, uh, and the seating is the same. But I was actually surprised to see they had an electrified version because I didn't know that, and I believe the South Shoreline uses the same track, so maybe they share the equipment for electrification at
Actually,
least.
speaking of the South Shore Line, um, well, first let's explain what it is. The South Shore Line is basically it's not operated as part of Metra, which is the Chicago transit commuter rail system, but it's operated independently as one line connecting downtown Chicago, and South Bend, Indiana, right? So going through, Gary, Indiana, the southern Chicago suburbs, and all that. Well, I mean, that counts as Chicago Transit, right?
Yeah, it definitely counts.
Definitely counts. Okay. Well, then I would like to also add that I have been on that as well. I took it from Dune Park by Indiana Dunes into downtown Chicago, which was quite nice.
And the South Shoreline, of course, is known for their street running segment in Michigan City. I think. Did you have a chance to see that?
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, not Michigan City. Not Michigan City itself, because that was east of me. But there were certainly parts where it was in close proximity to residential neighborhoods, which was quite nice. Honestly, the South Shoreline was pretty interesting. Not a lot of ridership, but certainly one way to get. It's going basically along. Well, not along the shore, right? But you can see the Chicago skyline in the distance, and it just slowly approaches that, which I think
Hmm.
is pretty neat.
Yeah. The other thing I was curious about the South Shoreline is that it terminates at South Bend Airport, which
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect many people to be needing to go to the airport in South Bend for their job rather than well, presuming most people will
Yeah.
use our commuters. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
do people
It's
transfer to the
really
planes there?
it's really weird. I mean, see, I guess it makes sense because people travelers from the airport, right, want to get where they're going. But in stopping at if you look at the map of South Bend, right, the South Shoreline, the airport is located at the western part of the city. So the South Shoreline comes in from the west, and it just curves upwards and then terminates at the airport, and that's it. It doesn't go into South Bend. There's no South Bend station. It's not even, the Amtrak station at South Bend is not even, linked up with the South Shore line. So I think in terms of that, it's an incredibly weird decision, especially since I would think that, there would be much more people from South Bend itself willing to go into Chicago than just from the airport. But yeah, I mean, that's honestly, like I said before, right? It doesn't even share the same station as the Amtrak station in South Bend, which I just don't think is a very smart decision. Although I
Yeah.
will say, oh, please.
Well, I was just wondering because I think I read recently that the South Shoreline is actually one of the last remaining interurban streetcar train systems from the early 1900s, and I wonder if there's just more connectivity at the airport area. Previously, of course, airports weren't around in the early 20th century, uh, but I wonder if it was the design is just a remnant of its earlier days when it probably had more use.
I mean, I guess that could be a theory. Although if you even if you look now, right, the the areas along which the South Shore one lines, it's certainly not population central, right? It's mostly industrial complex, um, in South Bend before curving up to the airport. So I mean, I guess it could be like you said, right, a remnant of that. Although I think certainly it would definitely make much more logical sense and definitely much more pleasing, if you will, for the line to terminate either in South Bend itself or at the Amtrak station, which, so that there can be easy transfer to and from Amtrak. Because the current situation, if you want to transfer Amtrak, is what is it? It's the transfer in, where is it? I believe you have to transfer in, um, actually, I'm actually not sure.
I
Is there
don't
an
know if
Amtrak?
there is a station that they both serve. So the Cardinal goes to Dyer. There is a station in Whiting, but I don't believe the South Shoreline uses that station
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Hammond
well,
Whiting.
Amtrak doesn't serve Gary either. Um, so I mean, I guess yeah. So if you want to transfer between Amtrak and the South Shoreline, the only thing you can do is to either get out and walk or transfer in Chicago, which is a pretty big hassle for Amtrak passengers coming in the east, effectively.
Yeah, the connections are certainly a lot worse than what you would have in actual Chicago between Amtrak and Metra, because of course there's a lot of stations like Naperville, Glenview, Lagrange, Joliet. There's a lot of Amtrak
Hmm.
connections to Metra, but there really isn't any to South Shoreline.
Hmm. I think actually in terms of Metra, there's one other very big problem that I have. Um,
And that's besides the hub and spoke piece, right?
well, besides the hub and spoke piece itself, right? That's I guess you kind of have to be hub and spoke. Well, you have to be hub and spoke to some extent, right? But there's another big problem, which I it just really pisses me off, if you will.
Yeah.
If you
And
look at a map of Metra and all the lines, right, you
mhm.
will see that they all terminate at different stations in Chicago. So, for example, right, the South Shoreline and the Metro Electric coming up from the south side of Chicago, it terminates at Chicago Millennium Station, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at, for example, um, the let's see, what is it? If you look at the Union Pacific North Line going all the way up to Kenosha, Wisconsin, um, as well as the Union Pacific West Line and the Union Pacific, well, the two Union Pacific, sorry, the Union Pacific West Line and the Union Pacific Northwest Line, right? They terminate at the Ogla. Sorry, how do you pronounce it? Ogilvy,
Yeah, I believe it's that. Yeah, Ogilvy.
Ogilvy Transportation Center, right? if you look at the BNSF ones, the BNSF lines and the Milwaukee District West line, basically other lines that come in from the south and from the west, they terminate at Chicago Union Station. And then there's one line, the Rock Island District line, which goes from Joliet and up into Chicago from the southwest, terminating at Chicago LaSalle Street, which is a separate station by itself. And so, like, you can see where I'm going with this, right? Like, it's there are four, there are not one, not two, not even three, but four stops for the terminus of rail lines. And what's even worse is that, for these lines, basically the only transfer between any of them is, well, the only transfer for any of them, right? If they don't, run along the same track, is at the transportation center, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is there's four of them. The transportation center, Union Station, whatever, the terminus station. There's four of them, right? Conversely, for example, some cities will have two stations, right? For example, New York with Grand Central and Penn Station. Um, Most cities will have just one, right? Washington Union Station, or Los Angeles Union Station, which is like the hub of both Amtrak and the all of the local commuter rail systems, right?
Hmm.
In Chicago, you have to not only know which one you're going to and from, but you have to also, physically get out and walk or take the L or get an Uber if you want to transfer between any of the lines, which I
Yeah,
just think is ridiculous.
and at least in other cities, like at least in New York, even though you have two stations, you can at least transfer between the Metro North trains at Grand Central, and all the Amtrak trains go to Penn Station. So it's easy in that regard. And of course, Metra in many cases is designed as a system where some people do go from, say, the western suburbs to the northern suburbs, and you would have to transfer for some of those lines to the other station, which is really inconvenient, like you said, because there's really poor transit connections between
Hmm.
each of the stations.
Yeah, it's um I mean, it's not just, it's something which is incredibly difficult for commuters, right? It's I suppose, physically it's not too much because they are all, a few blocks away from each other, right? Like, this is not, miles and miles apart. But it just makes, transferring to and from them that much harder, and it makes transit that much less of a viable option. Like, for example, let's say you want to go from, I don't know, you want to go from Winnetka in the north to, we'll say, I don't know, Joliet, right? You have to take the Union Pacific North line all the way down south into the Ogilvy Transportation Center, and then get out and physically walk, right, to Chicago Union Station. And how far is that exactly? It's like, what, three, four
Probably,
blocks?
yeah, it's probably like 5 to 10 minutes.
4 blocks. Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes, right? So it's it's not, it's certainly not the end of the world, but it is definitely an aspect which I just find, so, first of all, so irritating, and second of all, it just adds that little bit of having to get out and walk. It just makes transit, not a viable option anymore for so many people, right? Where they're just like, oh, I could just drive the whole thing, not have to get out at all, right? Not have to transfer, right? Not have to buy an entirely new ticket, wait on an entirely new platform, entirely new station, right? And yeah, that's basically, it just seems like a complete, it just seems like a complete disconnect, where you have, the trains that go north leave from one station, the trains that go west and southwest leave from another station, a train that goes south leaves from another station, and another one that goes south and southeast, right? They leave from another station. It's it's I don't know how to describe it. It's illogical, I suppose, is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, and my hunch is, and if you know the history, I'd love to hear it. But I would assume that since so Metra is, as you can tell from the naming, named after the freight railroads that used to operate the lines it serves. Of course, the BNSF was operated by the BNSF at one point before those rail services became unprofitable for the freight companies. So my guess is that a lot of these services they offer were originally were operated by the freight companies, which of course probably wanted to use different terminals to have their own tracks and to
Hmm.
have their own station. And I would assume that since Metra inherited that, they really couldn't do much about where these lines started. But of course, they've had 30 years to change that, and nothing has changed.
Yeah, well, actually, that's almost exactly the reason, right? So, BNSF, Union Pacific, even to this day, right? They often want to keep their freight terminals separate, because different companies, right? And so that kind of left its mark with having all these different stations and termini. But like they've had 30 years, they've had plenty of time to get things in better shape, which I think would, if there were just one point of connection, right, without having to get out and walk to another station, it would just make life so much easier and would also encourage ridership. But actually, the cherry on top to this big problem.
What's that?
You know what makes this big problem just so much nicer.
For Metra,
Well, just what makes it. You know what's a cherry on top for this big problem, this big
what
peeve.
is it? Curious.
So there are four termini, right?
Mm-hmm.
None of them connect with the L directly.
And not even LaSalle Street. Does that not have
Well, there
a
is a
station?
LaSalle station next door, but it's not connected. LaSalle is just kind of. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. LaSalle Street. Well, here it's not coherent. Let's just say that, right? The LaSalle station is next door. It's not regarded as. Actually, I'm not sure. Are
And
you able to get to and from the station directly?
I don't know, but it is only the blue line. So in terms of what it actually is going to help you with, you can't take any of the lines in the loop. So you can't actually
Actually,
get to any of the other of the transit stations.
yeah. Actually, here, I think let me rephrase that, right? So I think LaSalle it actually does have a direct connection. Like you can you can walk to different parts of the station. But like you said, like first of all, it's the blue line, right? Like you can't. It's not part. It's technically not part of the loop, so you have to transfer again if you want to get anywhere else in the hub and spoke. But another thing is that the LaSalle Street station is only the terminus for one line, which is the Rock Island District line to Joliet. So meaning, right? For example, the South Shore line, it terminates at Chicago Millennium Station, which is convenient, if you're coming to and from the Bean. But if you want to get on the L, you'll have to walk like quite a decent bit. I've actually had to walk that. It takes like what 10 minutes to walk to either Washington Wabash or Washington Station on the Blue Line. The other ones, the Ogilvy and Chicago Union Station, they are also located. Um, they're located west of the the loop, right? So you have to. It's kind of the same problem. You have to walk a few blocks just to even get on the L, and I just think that makes this so much. I said cherry on top, right? But it just makes this so much more irritating. Is what I find it to be.
Yeah, it's certainly when you combine the hub and spoke model of Metro with the hub and spoke model of the CTA, it really creates a very strange transit dynamic that maybe the loop is good for Chicago, at least from getting around. It's like the people mover in Detroit, where you can actually go between downtown uh, instead of having to walk a while. So I guess in that regard, it's good. But then, of course, for the people in the suburbs, it makes it really challenging if you want to go to another suburb. So it's hard to suit all. But I think we'll touch more on that when we give our grades out for the design.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, I would say, in terms of the actual, there's, I would say there's nothing intrinsic, like, well, not just that, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having a hub and spoke model, right? It's also necessary, for a lot of stations. I just think that, the two problems is that number one, there's a lack of connectivity between the suburbs themselves, and number two, even a lack of connectivity between the different stations amongst each other, right? Um, like for well, even it's not just well, it is obviously Metra and Metra, but and as well as Metra and the L, right? As we've demonstrated, but even sometimes the L and the L, right? Like for example, in the downtown loop portion, there's a lot of transfers which are not real transfers. Um, like it's not, oh, you can just get on another train, right? You have a lot of them are, you have to exit the station and then cross the street and then get back, tap your card again, basically paying another fare. I believe that's with, for example, the blue line and the red line, I believe, have
Hmm.
this sort of dynamic. So that's another thing which you have to be cautious on, right? Like if you mess up, if you get off at the wrong station, you realize, oh crap, this is actually a fake transfer, as I call it, right? Like you have to pay another fare, which I think is ridiculous again. Um, but I will say, in terms of the final thing, which I do want to talk about, right? The one last thing I want to bring up, and I think should be mentioned, is that the cost of a Chicago subway ride is certainly not like that of the San Francisco
There's the
Bay
Bay Area,
Area.
yeah.
Not even close, right? The full L train cost is 250 flat fare, go anywhere. And then there's also passes. There's a 1 day, 3 day, 7 day, and then 30 day, which range in price from $10 for the 1 day pass and $105 for the whole month pass. Which, I mean, a day pass on the Chicago L is like the price for one BARC ride, which I just think
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Yeah, when it comes to price, I mean, it's pretty unbeatable. And for the value for money, you certainly get a lot. Of course, it's not going to be as comfortable as BART, but do people really pay the money for BART for the comfort? Absolutely not, because people probably don't think about it that way. Uh, but given that the L system is so long, you can go from like Skokie to the south part of Chicago and only pay 250, and it's the same distance almost as from Antioch to San Francisco Airport. So I mean, it's insane how much value you can get out of the system. And Metro too isn't, to my knowledge, that expensive, especially if you pay with one of those venture cards.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine you get a discount. And I read too that the express buses also are, I believe, $5 for a ride, which is a lot cheaper than any express bus in New York. Uh, so yeah, like across the board, I was really surprised at how cheap it was. But I mean, it gets a lot of ridership, so obviously I don't think they have a fare box recovery problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, so yeah. So with all that in mind, right? Obviously, this is the time to assign the Chicago transit system a letter grade. So, I mean, Jack, would you like to go first as the non-Midwesterner? What would you give? Just just as a refresher, you gave the Bart San Francisco Bart a B plus. So if that if Bart is a B plus, what would you give the Chicago transit systems?
Well, actually, before I give out my grade, I did want to talk a bit more just about the yellow line because I know we haven't mentioned
Oh,
that, but
sure.
that's actually one example of a subway line in the CTA that goes essentially from a suburb to a suburb, and I would just point out that that's probably a model for something the CTA can do in the future because they can clearly add some higher speed subway tracks within the suburbs to connect to cities similar to Skokie and other parts of the city. And having ridden the yellow line, I found it actually to be a good system when it runs. Of course, it does not run very frequently, and that was problematic. But if it runs a lot, you can go between the cities quickly. So I did want to point that out, and that is a good example of something that can be done. But of course, with the frequency problems and the hub and spoke model being overwhelmingly existent in the city, I would give the system a higher grade than San Francisco. I'd give it an A minus. Uh, because you can go almost anywhere in the city. The Pace bus system, as we talked about, covers a lot of the city suburbs, not albeit frequently, but when you compare it to BART and to the Bay Area, the travel times are a lot quicker. And I think that it really comes down to the frequency being higher and the prices being cheaper. So all things considered, of the two we reviewed, Chicago is certainly the best in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
what
for
about
sure,
you?
for sure. For sure, for sure. I will also add one thing. I mean the yellow, as you said, right? The yellow line, which runs from Howard in the north, right, a transfer station, to and from Skokie, Dempster Skokie, and what Oakton Skokie, um, Skokie. Sorry. I think it definitely can be a model, right? It does effectively run to and from Skokie and a transfer stop, suburb to suburb. Um, you know, it, I guess we'll just have to see if that kind of model can be adopted throughout the entirety of the Chicago suburbs, Chicagoland suburbia, right? But in terms of the letter grade, right? I think I will actually agree with you that the Chicago does deserve an A minus. Again, it's important to remember that an A plus here is not perfect, but it is more serviceable, right? Obviously, if you're looking for better transit systems that can be found in Europe and in Asia and the rest of the world, but you know with since I gave the San Francisco BART system a normal B last time, I think Chicago does deserve its A minus. Like Jack, like you said, you definitely can go to a lot of places on all of the systems, right? The L is certainly it's certainly serviceable, and it does serve at pretty good frequencies, right? Unlike BART again, you don't have to wait like 30 minutes for your train. The Metra, it does a fine job as well. It's very connective to a lot of the far flung suburbs in Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin as well. And yeah, that so I think that all is what Chicago deserves credit for. At the same time, though, like I said, right, there is there could be massive improvement in the suburb to suburb connection as well as the system to system connection, right? The four different termini for commuter rail stations is certainly not something which one would logically assume from the third largest city in the United States, right? So that could definitely receive more work, but I will definitely, I think, as a total, a final grade, give Chicago the CTA, Metra, Pace buses, and all else. I would definitely give it an A minus as well.
Hmm. And it just occurred to me, what if Metra were to build their own loop in the city center? So their trains would
Oh
operate just
my
like the
god,
CTA. What if they could just go between the four termini and then go out on the route with? I wonder if that might be a good solution.
that might be a thing. Although I think physically, since the trains are so much longer, I think that would require some impressive engineering work to get the tunnels and all that sorted. But hey, double the loop fun.
And imagine them sharing tracks. So wouldn't that be a nightmare?
Oh my god, how I mean, are because like the L trains, they're explicitly designed like for the loop to be able to turn the almost 90-degree angle. So I'm trying to imagine like a metro locomotive trying to turn
Yeah.
that derailment. It's derailment time.
But yeah, anyway, that concludes our episode on our Chicago Transit review. It's notable we did end up on the same grade of an A minus. Obviously pointing out that the system works well in a lot of cases, but of course there's room for improvement, and that's I think the goal of these transit reviews is to explain how transit systems can be better all over the country. But Jahal, do you have any concluding thoughts you want to point out?
I would point out that. Well, I will also point out that Chicago, since Chicago is a hub for Amtrak, right? So all like and quite I do quite literally mean all of well actually no, I'm sorry. All but like one of the transcontinental routes leave from Chicago, right? As well as a ton of, local routes as well as within Illinois itself, right? So Chicago is quite the hub in so many different aspects, as we talked about. And I just think such a city, it deserves better and more accessible public transit.
Yeah, certainly. Any city would benefit from more of it, and that's what this podcast is here to do: explain how transit can be better all over the world and the country. So, tune in next time. Uh, the topic is undecided, but episodes will continue to be consistent like this one. And so, thank you all for listening.